Well, hello, everybody. We're going to get started now. I'm Kate Husseldens. I'm from the Mary Todd Lincoln House, and I want to welcome you to our program tonight, Death, Mourning, and Mrs. Lincoln. We're so glad to have everybody. So before I introduce our team and presenter, I wanted to go over a little Zoom housekeeping. You might have noticed that everyone has been muted upon entry, so you won't need to mute yourself. You may need to adjust your view at the top right-hand corner. You'll see a view because just in case you can't see all the PowerPoint slide, and you would have to go to the drop-down menu and to the side-by-side gallery, and that should fix the issue if that does occur. Also, throughout the presentation, if you have a question, go ahead and post it in this chat feature. We will go over those at the end. And you should be able to find the chat feature at the bottom of your screen in the middle of the Zoom taskbar. So I'd like to introduce our team tonight. We have Vicki Middlesworth. Give us a wave there, Vicki. She's got her camera on. We also have Gwen Thompson. She is off camera, but you'll probably see her in the chat when we get into the question and answer period. And for our presenter tonight, it's Linda Scott, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Linda.
Thank you again, and welcome to tonight's program. We're very glad that you decided to join us tonight. You're probably aware that today is the anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's death, and that Mary Lincoln suffered many losses in her life. Many of them were similar to those that other Americans experienced at that time, larger context. The first death Mary may have been aware of was that of her mother in July 1825. 31-year-old Eliza Parker Todd died after the birth of her seventh child. This was not unusual at a time when 1 of 8 women died during a pregnancy or childbirth. This funeral notice suggests that the Todd family could have held a service at home before going to one of Lexington's burial grounds. The Todds were founding members of Lexington's Second Presbyterian Church. The words of its first minister reflect religious views of the time, that heaven was a better place than earth, but it wasn't easy to get there. How sweetly could I lay my head within the cold grave's silent breast, where sorrow's tears no more are shed, no more the ills of life molest. For, my heart, so very soon the glittering dreams of youth are past, and long before it reach its noon, the sun of life is overcast. Mary's stepmother, Betsy Todd, may be the person who copied the first stanza of this poem into a history book. She may have had similar feelings to the poets. "25 years after Eliza's death, Mary's father, Robert Todd, died suddenly. The cause was listed as bilious fever, a term used at the time for intestinal and malarial disorders. Death by disease was common in Lexington during the summer of 1849, when the city was suffering through its second cholera epidemic in less than 20 years. But in spite of unpleasant symptoms, Robert Todd likely experienced what Americans of the time considered a good death. He was at home, surrounded by loved ones, and prepared to meet his maker. A decade later, the Civil War challenged this comforting view of the end of life. At the time of her father's death, Mary was living in Springfield, Illinois, with Abraham, her husband of almost 7 years, and their sons, 6-year-old Robert and 3-year-old Eddie. 6 months later, Eddie died from what was probably tuberculosis, then known as consumption. That year, consumption caused more deaths than any other disease, and 40% of deaths in the United States were children under the age of 5. A week after Eddie's death, A poem entitled Little Eddie appeared in a local newspaper. It reflected an idea that contrasted with Reverend McCord's bleak prediction that innocent children went to heaven when they died. Some of Mary's biographers speculated that she wrote the poem, but it was actually composed by a young St. Louis poet named Mary Chamberlain. Mary was not a stranger to the deaths of young children. Her younger brother, Robert Parker Todd, had died at age 1 in 1822. Her first half-brother, also named Robert, died in infancy in 1827. Julia, a daughter born to her older sister Elizabeth, died in 1836. Mary was less prepared for the death of her own son, Willie, at age 11. The Lincolns were living in the White House, and their youngest sons, Willie and Tad, had come down with what was probably typhoid fever. After suffering from intestinal disorders and high fevers for several weeks, Willie died on February 20th, 1862. He was unconscious for the last few days of his life, so there were no last words to give Mary the peace parents sought when a child died. This photo of Mary is thought to have been taken in 1862. It illustrates one way women demonstrated their grief, by wearing black clothing. 19th century women were expected to grieve, but in a pious, restrained way that reflected their passive acceptances of death. Dressmaker Elizabeth Keckley used these words in describing the anything but passive reactions of both Lincolns to Willie's passing. Other writers have focused on Mary and have suggested that she grieved excessively. But there is also evidence that within a few months, Mary resumed some of her duties as First Lady. She attended military demonstrations with Abraham and resumed her volunteer work in Army hospitals. Our home is very beautiful. The grounds are enchanting. The world still smiles and pays homage, yet the charm is dispelled. Everything appears a mockery. The idolized one is not with us. He has fulfilled his mission, and we are left desolate. My question to myself is, can life be endured? This quote is from a letter that Mary wrote to a friend in Springfield 3 months after Willie's death. Privately, Mary struggled to resign herself to this loss. Willie and Tad may have gotten sick from drinking Potomac River water or from visiting Union Army camps, which were rife with disease. If the camps were the cause, Willie could be considered a casualty of the Civil War. Notice the symbols of war and peace on this White House china dinner plate. When Mary ordered it, many people thought that the Civil War would last only a few months. In July 1861, 860 soldiers died in one day at the Battle of Manassas. By April 1865, at least 620,000 had died. That number is roughly equal to the total American fatalities in the Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World Wars I and II, and the Korean War combined. The Lincolns lost a friend to the war when Elmer Ellsworth died in May 1861. Ellsworth had worked on Abraham's presidential campaign and had traveled with the family to Washington. When Ellsworth and his company tore down the Confederate flag flying over an inn in Alexandria, Virginia, the owner shot him. He was the first Union officer to die in the war. Unlike many of the soldiers who perished later in the war, Elmer was honored in a funeral. His remains lay in state in the White House, and thousands of people observed the funeral march through the streets of Washington, decorated with American flags wrapped with black crepe. As First Lady of the Union, Mary Lincoln could express her, excuse me, as First Lady of the Union, Mary Lincoln could, should I stop?
No, 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 no. You're gonna have to stop her. Stop her. Right now. Okay.
I'm going to pause for a moment. Okay, I shall resume. As First Lady of the Union, Mary Lincoln could express her grief for Elmer in public. She had to mourn the loss of her own family members more privately. This map shows the locations of Mary's siblings when the war started. 4 of the 5 Todd sons joined the Confederate Army. 2 of them and a beloved brother-in-law died. Half-brother Sam was shot at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, less than 2 months after Willie Lincoln's death. Sam's death was one of hundreds of thousands that challenged the idea of the good death. It is uncertain whether his remains were buried in a group or an unmarked grave. This was not unusual after major Civil War battles. To soften the blow for family members, the officers and comrades of the fallen wrote letters of condolence. Mary's half-brother David, who is best known for mistreating Union captives at a prison in Virginia. But on April 15, 1862, he wrote a touching letter to his sister Emily, trying to portray Sam's death in comforting terms. Four months later, the youngest Todd's son, Alec, died in a friendly fire incident near Baton Rouge. He decided against my husband, and through him against me. He has been fighting against us, and since he chose to be our deadly enemy, I see no special reason why I should bitterly mourn his death. Newspaper coverage of Sam's and Alec's death led some people to question the First Lady's loyalty. Dressmaker Elizabeth Keckley recalled that Mary responded to Alec's death with these words, denying the feelings people were supposed to show for their lost loved ones. However, Todd family members recalled that Mary grieved, but in secret. Elizabeth Keckley used the phrase golden words of comfort to describe a condolence letter Mary Lincoln wrote to her when her son George died while serving in the Union Army. George's father was a white man who forced himself on Elizabeth when she was enslaved. George was able to pass for white and joined the Missouri Infantry early in the war. He died in August 1861 at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. There is evidence that Elizabeth Keckley made mourning clothing for Mary. Advice literature provided complicated and sometimes conflicting guidelines for mourning attire. Women who followed the strictest rules began with plain black clothing without any embellishment. When they left the house, they wore a veil, like the one Mary's half-sister Emily is wearing in this photo. In the second stage of mourning, women could wear fancier black clothing and plain accessories such as jet jewelry. As time passed, they could transition into shades of gray or purple. Historian Drew Gilpin Faust has suggested that changing from color to color over time helped women cope by making their recovery from their loss palpable. Wearing black clothing and using black bordered stationery were 2 conventional ways Mary expressed her grief. She also tried to follow the advice of clergymen and draw comfort from her faith. But her words and actions reflected an ongoing struggle to accept the deaths of lost loved ones. She was not alone in that struggle. Many Americans found it hard to cope with the increasing numbers of soldiers' deaths. Some began to question the war. Some questioned their religious beliefs. Some even died of grief. Others resorted to unorthodox strategies like spiritualism. The spiritualist movement began in the United States around 1850. Its popularity soared during the Civil War as people tried to come to terms with the enormous death toll. Spiritualists believed it was possible to communicate with the dead through a medium. This may sound like the occult, but spiritualism was a non-orthodox religious movement that had ties to the early women's rights movement. Washingtonians who consulted with mediums included Lincoln's Commissioner of Agriculture, Secretary of the Navy, and the Lincolns themselves. There is evidence that Mary and Abraham Lincoln attended seances and that mediums visited the White House. One of these was trance medium Nettie Colburn. She was serious about her ability to communicate with the dead or see the future while entranced. Mary believed that Nettie could share messages from Willie Lincoln. Another medium known as Lord Colchester was a little more suspect. Mary invited him to conduct a seance at the Soldiers' Home, where the Lincolns lived during the summer. Colchester seemingly produced messages from Willie through scratches and taps on the walls and furniture. Journalist and Lincoln family friend Noah Brooks later attended a Colchester seance and proved the medium was a fraud. Clergymen like Phineas Gurley, who presided over Willie Lincoln's funeral, disapproved of spiritualism. But people who practiced it often remained faithful to their religious beliefs. This was true of Mary, who told a friend she believed that Willie's death was a punishment from God because the Lincolns had become too worldly. But this quote from a letter reflects her concern about accepting that idea. How often I feel rebellious and almost believe that our Heavenly Father has forsaken us in removing so lovely a child from us. Yet I know a great sin is committed when we feel thus. When Mary's half-sister Emily visited the White House after her husband's battle death, she stayed in the room where Willie had died. One night, Mary came into the room and told Emily that Willie visited her at night, sometimes accompanied by his brother Eddie or their brother Alec. He comes to me every night and stands at the foot of my bed with the same sweet, adorable smile he has always had. He does not always come alone. Little Eddie is sometimes with him, and twice he has come with our brother Alec. You cannot dream of the comfort this gives me. But Mary wasn't the only Lincoln who had dreams. Abraham dreamt that he saw two reflections of his face in a mirror, one healthy and one with a ghostly paleness. Shortly before his death, he dreamt of following the sound of weeping to the East Room, where mourners were gathered around a casket. When he asked who had died, he was told that the president had been assassinated. By the way, Mary was present when he related this dream and was reported to say, "That is horrid. I'm glad I don't believe in dreams." On April 15, 1865, Mary Lincoln was dealt the blow most unlike those suffered by many other Americans. The night before, John Wilkes Booth crept into the box at Ford's Theater, where Abraham and Mary were watching a play, and shot the president. The event was not documented with photographs, and artists later used written descriptions to recreate the scene, often incorrectly, as in this print, which shows Abraham standing up after being shot. This deathbed image has at least two mistakes. Ted Lincoln was not present, and Mary spent most of the night in another room. Lincoln's was not a good death. The head wound rendered him unconscious, so he was unable to articulate his awareness of his death, his readiness to meet his Maker, and his wishes for the survivors. It was equally horrible for Mary, who was not by his side for most of the night. Now he belongs to the ages. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton is credited with saying these words when Lincoln died. One historian has suggested that the extensive events associated with his death may have served as surrogates for all the Civil War funerals many citizens could not attend. Nearly 25,000 people filed through the White House to see Lincoln's coffin. Over 100,000 more watched the procession to the Capitol, where his remains lay in state. Thousands gathered along the railroad lines as the funeral train traveled to Springfield, stopping in 12 cities where enormous crowds gathered to express their grief. Mary didn't participate in these public events. She sequestered herself in the White House and refused all visitors but her closest friends. But she did find time to write thank you notes for letters of condolence, including this one from Queen Victoria. In the letter, Victoria used these words to describe her feelings about the death of her own husband a few years before. "No one can appreciate better than I can, who am utterly brokenhearted by the loss of my husband, who was the light of my life, my stay, my all, what your sufferings must be." Mary also went to battle with Springfield officials who wanted to bury Abraham's remains in the center of town. Mary preferred a quieter resting place for the family vault in Oak Ridge, a garden cemetery on the edge of town. This decision was in keeping with many Americans' preference for rural resting places, but it also secured a place for Mary with her husband. Several years later, Mary's stepmother, Betsy Todd, left money in her will for a memorial in the Lexington Cemetery. The inscription reads, "In memory of my boys, all Confederate soldiers." In doing this, Betsy joined families all over the South in commemorating those who had fallen. One reason for the establishment of these monuments may have been that the remains of Confederate soldiers could not be interred in the new national cemeteries. Efforts to account for and bury the remains of Federal soldiers had led the government to establish 74 national cemeteries, including this one in Lexington. Historian Drew Gilpin Faust has suggested that the rows of plain markers represent the enormous cost of war. Verses from Kentucky poet Theodore O'Hara's poem are posted in many national cemeteries. Mary lived for 17 years after Abraham's death. In that time, she settled her debts, traveled in Europe, and celebrated the births of 3 grandchildren. But in 1871, she suffered another loss when her son Tad died from a lung condition at age 18. Mary wrote these words 3 months after Tad's death. "As grievous as other bereavements have been, not one great sorrow ever approached the agony of this." Early in 1872, she sat for photographer William Mumler, who exploited grieving people by imposing ghostly images of their lost loved ones on their pictures.
Oh my God. Whoa, that's so cool.
Excuse me, ma'am, can you mute your video, please? Thank you. But Mary was a survivor. She endured a trial and subsequent incarceration for insanity and again traveled to Europe. On the way, she stopped in Lexington and visited the cemetery. She lived in France for several years until her health gave out. In 1880, she returned to the United States and died a year later, one day after the anniversary of Tad's death. If this illustration is accurate, Mary would have been pleased with the funeral service. One floral arrangement represented the pearly gates, ajar with a bust of Abraham on the other side. The choir sang "Nearer My God to Thee," and the pastor alluded to the Lincolns as 2 pine trees that had grown together on the same rocky crevice until their roots became entwined. One was blasted by a storm and died, and the other withered until after years of suffering, it finally perished. Mary's remains were buried with those of Abraham and their sons Eddie, Willie, and Tad in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. Mary had long looked forward to a reunion with loved ones after death. She wrote these words just before the 12th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. God gives us our beloved ones. We make them our idols. They are removed from us, and we have patiently to await the time when He reunites us to them. And the waiting is so long. Yet the time will come when the severance will be over, together, husband, wife, and children, never more to be separated. That's the end of our formal program, and now we will have some answers to questions from the chats.
Does anyone have any questions? I don't see any in the chat, so if you want to go ahead and, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in there. Okay, here's a question.
Oh, yeah.
So let's see, we have a question here. Mary's son, and you're talking about Robert Todd Lincoln, had her committed at the end of her life, did he not? When do you want to answer that one?
Yes, that's absolutely true that there was a 1-year period of her life that we refer to as the insanity trial period. And those events occurred between 1875 and 1876. However, after the insanity trial, her brief commitment, and then a second trial, she was actually declared restored to reason and went on to live for another 6 years independently, including a trip to Europe where she lived for many years. So that is definitely one of the controversies associated with Mary Lincoln in her widowhood during her 17 years of widowhood.
Okay, so we have another question. Do we know what the mourning jewelry Mrs. Lincoln is wearing in the formal portrait? Vicki looks like is going to answer this one.
Hi, everybody. We're working on 2 computers so we can avoid sound feedback. So you might see us moving around a little bit. I don't know what the jewelry is for sure. My guess is that it's jet, which is a black shiny stone. And we don't have this book listed for you, but a writer named Donna McCreary has written a book about Mary's clothing. And that would be the book to look for if you really wanted to learn more. She's probably figured out what that jewelry is. That's Donna McCreary, McCreary. And I think the name of the book is Fashionable First Lady.
Okay, someone's asking if we can get rid of that screen sharing, that it's a little distracting.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Okay, and another question was, did she ever meet Queen Victoria? And I think I know the answer that she did not. Let's see here. Let me see. Now I've lost the chat. On here.
And so tech is not our strong suit. I cannot tell if I have successfully ended the screen share. Have I succeeded with that, Kate?
Yeah, you did. You did. I lost my little. Here we go. We have some work taught. Here we go. Someone's asking if we can talk more about what Mary did right after Lincoln's assassination. Was she allowed to see Lincoln? And is it true that Stanton forbade her to come back in?
You know, there are conflicting accounts about that. And even here at the Mary Todd Lincoln House for years, we said, oh, Stanton wouldn't let her come back in. But there are some accounts that say that she voluntarily went to a different room in the Peterson house, which was across the street from Ford's Theater, and that she may have actually chosen to spend part of the night there. She probably would have wanted to be with him when he actually passed away, and I don't believe that she was, but we don't really have a solid answer about whether Stanton actually expelled her from the room.
It looks like I skipped a question. Somebody asked if Mary responded to the Queen Victoria's letter.
I believe she did, but I am not absolutely positive about that. I feel like I have recently seen something online saying here's her response. She also got a condolence letter in French from Eugenie, who's the French empress at the time. So Lincoln's death really was an international affair.
Okay. And we have another question. Didn't Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker, Elizabeth Keckley, write a book about her?
She did. She published a book called Behind the Scenes, which was an autobiographical account of her own life, and about half the book is about her life leading up to the years when she worked with Mary Lincoln. She was born into slavery, and she purchased her freedom through her dressmaking skills. But a few years after Abraham Lincoln's death, she wrote this autobiographical account, and that kind of ended the relationship between Mary and Elizabeth Keckley. And that book is available online. If you Google Elizabeth Keckley Behind the Scenes, you can find it online and read it, or you can also purchase it.
And someone's asking us about where we found that basically the citation for a source of the small photo of Eddie, and that they think the photo is usually labeled as a young Willie.
Well, we're not actually sure that it's Eddie, but I don't think we think it's a young Willie. There is some discussion about that photo, and we decided to go ahead and use it because it shows you what a young child would look like at the time. Our photo of Willie in one of the other slides is definitely Willie, but I don't think that one is Willie. Was Willie.
Okay. Okay, another question. Did Mary wear mourning clothing her whole life after her husband's death, just like Queen Victoria did?
As far as we know, she did wear black for almost the rest of her life. There is one account that says she put on a white dress one time because Tad asked her to wear white for a special celebration of some kind. And she was initially very fashionable in her black clothing, but as she got older, as happens with many people, she dressed more plainly, but still in black.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions for us? Okay. Okay, somebody came here today and noticed that the cup gifted to Tad when Willie died, were there any other items gifted to the family upon his or Lincoln's death?
I'm not aware of anything else, certainly in our collection, that was gifted after Willie's death. There may have been things sent to Mary after Abraham's death, but I'll ask Gwen if she knows anything. I'm looking across the desk and she's shaking her head. So
I can't speak broadly to what might be in all the collections out there.
right.
The mug that you're referencing, the little silver mug, in honor of Willie's passing, was given to Tad Lincoln and is in our collection. But that is the only item of that type that we have in our collection associated with anyone's death. And of course, we have a lot of deaths that we talk about here.
One of the things that happened after Abraham's death is that Mary gave some of his belongings to other people, and there are letters documenting that. She'll say, I'm sending you a cane that belonged to my beloved husband. So some of those things have found their way into collections around the country, but not to this one.
Okay, another question is, how quickly did Mary leave the White House after the death of the president, and where did she go? Where did she live after that?
She stayed in the White House for several weeks, and that was with the approval of the new president, Andrew Johnson. She left in about the third week of May. And she went to Chicago. She had told people that she and Abraham Lincoln had talked about moving to Chicago after his presidency. So she was accompanied by her sons Robert and Ted, and initially by Elizabeth Keckley, who went with them for a short period of time.
Okay. Another question is, did Mary continue to talk to Emily after the White House?
We do not have evidence that Mary and Emily communicated after the White House years. There was a bit of a flap before Abraham Lincoln died when Emily requested a pass from the president to travel south to deal with some business dealings of her husband, who was deceased at that point, and that he denied that request, and that kind of cut off relations between Emily and Mary.
Okay. I don't see any. Does anyone have any more questions? Okay. Well, those were all really good questions. So
Very good.
thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. If there's no more questions, we will wrap it up, and hope to see you at another program sometime, another Zoom or something we have in person if you're here in Lexington.